Welcome to Godzilla number 5, San Daikaiju Chikyu Saidai no Kessen, or for you English speakers out there, 3 giant monsters, Earth's greatest battle. We're currently watching the American recut, Ghidrah, the three-headed monster. The original Japanese version opened on December 20th, 1964, with a running time of 95 minutes. An altered, shortened American recut running 85 minutes opened in the States about a year later on September 29th, 1965. For the next 85 minutes, I'll be yammering at you about this film and comparing it back against its original form, as well as a third variant released in Japan towards the end of the decade. While I'm at it, I'll also connect the dots to its immediate prequel Mothra vs. Godzilla, and the movie that was made almost simultaneously to this one by essentially the same cast and crew, Ghidorah, the space monster. I am David Kalat, author of the critical history and filmography of Toho's Godzilla series published by McFarland Press. I'm delighted to be here with you, even if only in the form of a disembodied voice, for what is one of my very favorite monster movies and one of the coolest Godzilla movies ever made. Before we begin, though, I need to say a quick word about my fellow Godzilla fans. When I first started to try to make my way in the world as a professional film historian, I was frustrated and discouraged that at that moment in time, Godzilla had never received any serious consideration. The best you could find in terms of critical discussions of this phenomenon of popular culture was dismissive or contemptuous and often riddled with factual errors and misunderstandings. I stepped into that breach to try to correct the record. I was not the first in this mission, nor was I ever alone. I was quite consciously following the footsteps of Stuart Galbraith and keenly reliant on the research published by J.D. Lees in the magazine G-Fan. Ed Godziszewski, Steve Reifel, Guy Mariner Tucker, Robert Biondi, York Bootger-Wright, these are just some of the names of the researchers and fans from whom I stole, I guess you could say. Gradually, as the fan press started to grow and cohere into a movement, something of a fan ideology evolved, with its own dogmas about what was and was not acceptable. In the interest of promoting a serious consideration of Godzilla, only a serious Godzilla would do, and so notions of camp comedy were feverishly resisted. And since it was the Americanization of the films that represented the most in-your-face lack of respect for the Japanese originals, these too were rejected. Now, I bring all of this up because it's of critical importance to us in evaluating the importance, merits, and legacy of Ghidrah, the three-headed monster. This movie was virtually the last Godzilla movie to be substantially altered for American release. Immediately after its manufacture, Toho Studios formed an alliance with an American distributor to ensure that such alterations could be incorporated into the original productions. With the exception of Godzilla 1985, all subsequent Godzilla films released in the US would be minimally adapted, if at all. And secondly, Ghidrah is one of the funniest Godzilla movies, and its comic elements are a source of friction with the anti-camp fan brigade. For many fans, Ghidrah marks a turning point where the Godzilla franchise slid into a silliness that they would have you believe ultimately killed off the series in 1975. Yet, this movie is inarguably beautifully made, a real high point for Toho's craftspeople, clearly at the top of their game. The tension between the stylishness of this classy production and the elements that fans rankle against is compromised its standing for too long. As we proceed, I'm going to make my case against the fan ideology and do my part to promote an acceptance of, even a celebration of both Godzilla comedy and the American alterations. I prefer the American cut, even if saying so is a Godzilla heresy, but I hope to have persuaded you to join me in my heresy when we're all done. And with this in mind, I want to bring your attention to this crashing meteor right here. It is the first of the changes wrought to the US version, and more on that subject anon. Detective Shindo here, the policeman hero of the film, is played by Yosuke Natsuki. I need to single him out right off the bat because my ignorant misidentification of him in my book is a source of embarrassment for me. Natsuki was primarily a comic actor. He did appear in 2 of Toho's science fiction flicks, both in 1964. He didn't return to the genre until 1984 for the revival of Godzilla released here as Godzilla 1985. And interestingly, he did so in a role originally written for Akihiko Hirata, the gentleman sitting opposite him right now playing his superior officer. Hirata was a popular performer in these sci-fi spectacles, starting with the very first Godzilla in 1954. Hirata had a law degree from Tokyo University. One imagines that helped him win the case of Godzilla v. Ebirah. Sorry, that was a very bad law student joke, but seriously, he joined up with Toho as an assistant director and eventually moved on to a more successful career as an actor. Sadly, after work began on the 1984 Godzilla, he was felled by cancer, and his friend Yosuke Natsuki stepped in to take over his role. Originally, the brilliant and criminally underrated character actor Yoshio Tsuchiya was supposed to appear in this movie as Malnus, the assassin here sent to kill Princess Salno. Tsuchiya was one of Ishiro Honda's most favored performers, and interestingly, Akira Kurosawa also admired Tsuchiya. And that sometimes created scheduling conflicts. Tsuchiya was already committed to Kurosawa for the film Redbeard, and ultimately had to drop out of Ghidrah, and instead Hisaya Ito took over the part of Malnus. If you're going to come away from this commentary remembering anything I've said, I want it to be the name Shinichi Sekizawa. In my personal estimation, Sekizawa is one of the principal creative forces behind these movies being as powerful and entertaining as they are, and of all the ink that has been spilled over Godzilla in recent years, very little has been spent in honor of Sekizawa. He started out as an animator, studying at the Kyoto Animation Studio alongside Osamu Tezuka, arguably Japan's most influential manga artist. We can imagine the critical role it would later play in Sekizawa's profession that he began his creative life so intimately connected to visual storytelling and trick photography. But before that can come to any fruition, we need to insert a painful lacuna into the man's life. World War II came along, and Sekizawa found himself drafted into service in the South Pacific. From 1941 until 1946, he was stuck in bug-infested muggy islands with nothing to eat. Sekizawa hated the war. He was hungry, and he wanted to go home. When the war ended, and he finally did get to go home, he set his mind to eating, and living life to its joyful fullest. Ishiro Honda once said that Sekizawa was never political, but we have to take that comment with a grain of salt, or perhaps even the whole damn salt shaker, because Sekizawa's colleague on the Toho lot writing these science fiction spectacles was Takashi Kimura, a dour, dark man who was probably followed around his whole life by a little cloud perpetually raining on him. Kimura was most explicitly political, and his status as a card-carrying member of the Communist Party was something of an issue for him. Obviously, compared to Kimura, Sekizawa was certain to be seen as apolitical. But if we take the man in his own context, I think it's fair to say that his joie de vivre, his lust for life, his eat, drink, and be merry philosophy was his own personal political response to the ascetic authoritarianism behind Imperial Japan's wartime ambitions. Once back home from the war, Sekizawa found time between meals to reboot his film career, initially at the marvelously named Beehive Studios. He started off as an assistant director, but was recommended for a writing gig as well. He managed to turn in a finished script for Profile of the City in just 4 days, a record so astonishing, he cemented a career there and then. In 1956, over at Shin Toho, that's not Toho, it's a different studio, Shin Toho, he wrote and directed a now-forgotten sci-fi bauble called Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucers. That's a rough translation. I'd imagine if it got an American release, someone would have cooked up a punchier English title for the thing. Hot on its heels, Sekizawa was asked to develop a TV series about a giant monster, and thus was born Agon, a not very good show that, regardless of quality, had Toho feeling grumbly because someone was stepping on their toes. They pulled some legal strings and killed Agon. To keep Sekizawa from developing any further viable competition, I mean, the guy was hot. They put him to work on their own projects, first with Varan in 1958. This particular movie was nothing to write home about, and Sekizawa had at least found a niche and would specialize in monster movie scenarios until his retirement in 1974 with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. It's often cited that Toho assigned Kimura to the darker, more adult, more politically charged stories, while Sekizawa got all those so-called childish gigs. And it is further alleged by the fan press that I mentioned before that Sekizawa's joke-happy irreverence brought rot to the Godzilla formula and turned it into something laughable, which ultimately killed it. Later on in the commentary, I'll turn my attention to debunking this second assertion, but for now I'll just tackle the first. In Guy Tucker's book Age of the Gods, he cites an interchange between Kimura and Sekizawa. Kimura asks Sekizawa, "Do you really enjoy writing this?" Sekizawa replies, "Of course, I think it's a lot of fun." Kimura broods, "Not for me." You see, Sekizawa loved monster movies. I mean, you cannot watch these things and ever think otherwise. He is without question enjoying himself, and that enthusiasm spills over into the audience as well. Sekizawa's passion worked to make this genre his own, or more broadly, how his contributions made Toho's science fiction spectacles into unique cultural expressions. After Varan, Sekizawa admitted that he was bored by the typical monster on the loose scenario. Godzilla, Rodan, Varan, these movies were formula pictures, and he wanted to change the formula. His ambition, which was something no other screenwriter involved in giant monster movies anywhere else in the world was even considering, now seems elegantly simple and obvious: to interconnect the human dramas with the monster action. In other words, the human characters didn't have to be reacting to the monster mayhem. It could work the other way around. You could distribute monster effect sequences throughout the picture, not just concentrated at the end, and still have a coherent narrative that continued to develop equally well when the actors were stuntmen in rubber suits as when they were trained thespians. If you look at the classical giant monster template as seen in something like, let's say, King Kong, or the earliest of Toho's contributions to the genre, the human drama is driven by the monster scenes. What happens to the main characters, how they comport themselves, what they do, that will settle the monster problem by killing or vanquishing the giant animal and its threat. If you look at the way Japanese monsters took over in the 1960s and 70s and where they ultimately went, the pattern is turned on its head. In the old paradigm, monsters threaten people and people resolve it. In the new Japanese iteration, people threaten people and monsters resolve it. Already by 1962, Sekizawa's inversion of the genre template was well underway. In both Mothra and King Kong vs. Godzilla, he happily treated his monster characters as actual characters with distinct personalities and motivations. In Mothra, the giant monster was not a mindless brute, but a delicate and beautiful god with an actual grievance that she was attending to in a violent, city-smashing sort of way. But nevertheless, the movie so much took for granted that the audience would be sympathetic with her that the film ends with the heroes waving goodbye to the monster and inviting her back. Ghidrah's production schedule was tight. It rushed into theaters a scant 9 months after Mothra vs. Godzilla. But if we take a look at Toho's output of science fiction films in the 60s, we'll find something even more startling. In 1961, Mothra. Then 1962, Gorath and King Kong vs. Godzilla. Come 1963, we've got Atragon and Matango. 1964 brings Mothra vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the Space Monster, and Ghidrah. In 4 years, they made 8 science fiction spectacles. As the decade progressed, the pace of production only increased. And every single one of those 8 big pictures during those 4 short years was produced by Tomoyuki Tanaka, directed by Ishiro Honda, effects by Eiji Tsuburaya. Akira Ifukube scored 7 of those 8 films. Shinichi Sekizawa wrote the screenplays for 6 of them. In fact, the production team is exactly the same for all of the ones made in 1964. Same writer, director, producer, special effects crew, soundtrack composer, cinematographer, art director, and editor. In the casts, there are 8 actors who appeared in 2 or more of the 3 films. Toho was a factory in the 1960s. The fact that some of these films are true classics of the genre is an astounding testament to the folks behind them. Mothra vs. Godzilla premiered on April 29, 1964. Ghidorah followed that on August 11th, not quite 4 months later. Ghidrah came along on December 20th, 4 months after that. The distance between these premieres is insufficient to actually complete the work within. You can't make a movie of this scale in 4 months. So these projects overlapped, produced in tandem and finished in serial. So of their common elements, there must have been cross-pollination behind the scenes. One obvious feature shared in common by both Ghidorah and Ghidrah is that each stars a space monster. And the question is always, where does the monster come from? There are only so many times you can have a nuclear bomb test revive a prehistoric beast. Sekizawa had already tried giant animals worshipped as gods on remote islands, so how's about outer space? Additionally, both Ghidorah and Ghidrah find Mr. Sekizawa blending the space monster action with other more traditional thriller genres. Ghidorah is monsters plus cops and robbers. Ghidrah is monsters plus 007-style spy movies. Add to that the fact that Ghidrah and Ghidorah share 5 of the same cast members and sometimes the same physical structures. Both movies make use of the same police station set, for example. One of the shared actors is Mr. Hiroshi Koizumi here, who had the distinction of playing essentially the same scientist character in all three of Toho's effects films of 1964. Toho had groomed him as a star for years through a program called New Faces. This was a fantastic idea, vaguely like American Idol. One of Japan's biggest, most prolific movie studios sought out undiscovered talent. Ordinary members of the public, untrained amateurs, would enroll in this competition. The studio picked out the ones they thought had star potential, and these winners would then receive acting training while being put before the public in various films, starting with small roles to see who clicked. Koizumi had been working as a TV announcer when the New Face program catapulted him into starring roles in teen-oriented pictures in the 1950s. Curiously, in both Ghidorah and Ghidrah, Koizumi's role is one of the axes of a defanged romantic triangle. In both films, there's a heroine linked between the scientist played by Koizumi and the cop played by Yosuke Natsuki. One is her boyfriend, one is her brother. The only thing that changes between the two films is which one is her brother, Koizumi or Natsuki, and the actress playing the girl. Now, I could go on about whom that actress playing the girl in Ghidorah is, but this isn't Ghidorah we're watching right now. The actress in this movie is Yuriko Hoshi, returning from a similar starring role in Mothra vs. Godzilla. As we shall see later, Ms. Hoshi has been given a substantial promotion in this picture. In the Japanese cut, this sequence at home with Naoko and Shindo is much longer and shows playful banter and gentle teasing between them that emphasized their relationship as brother and sister. The American cut dropped these shots, and in so doing made Shindo seem more serious and heroic, because the cut material presented him in a very childish light. I'll talk later about how there was a later Japanese reissue in 1969 that copied many of the American cuts, but pointedly the extra material with Shindo and Naoko teasing each other like kids was retained in that version. It clearly meant something to Honda, and he was loath to let it go. When Ghidrah was distributed in the United States in 1965, it was primarily on a double bill with Elvis Presley's musical comedy Harem Scarum. The advertising screamed, "The Beat and the Beast make a holiday feast." But even back home, Ghidrah had already been paired with a comedy. It was released in Japan on a double bill with Samurai Joker, directed by Kajiro Yamamoto, the venerable director who taught Honda and Akira Kurosawa the craft of filmmaking. Samurai Joker was part of a franchise called the Crazy Cats, which aren't well known to Western viewers, but which were a much bigger part of Toho's output than these sci-fi thrillers. There was a lot of overlap in cast between Ishiro Honda's monster flicks and the Crazy Cats comedies, and after a while the Crazy Cats comedies even started to take advantage of Eiji Tsuburai's skills for special effects. I'm indebted to Stuart Galbraith for this information, since he's been the main voice publicizing the Crazy Cats comedies in the West, and to date, none of these comedies have ever been released here in any form. Speaking of comedians, the two comics on stage right now are Senya Aozora and Ichiya Aozora, and unlike the Peanuts, these two are not actually related. They were a comedy team, these were their stage names. Their wordplay and back-and-forth verbal patter has been compared to vaudeville and Abbott and Costello. It wasn't unique to the Aozoras, it was a comedy tradition called manzai. Yoshihito Sakai, which is the real name of the one billed as Senya Aozora, was a coal miner who left home and went to the big city with those classic dreams of making it big in show business, and he paired up with Ichiya to form the Aozora team, and they won a manzai competition in 1960. They appeared on TV a lot in the 1960s and released some albums, never really caught on in films. I don't know if their appearance here was a tryout to check audience reaction for giving them a bigger role in a future film. If that was the plan, there was no future film, but I really quite like them here. And since we're trying to chart the presence of comedy in Godzilla, the arrival of a pair of known comedians basically replicating their stage act is notable. And the whole purpose of the scene is a sort of parody of the two previous Mothra films, even though this parody is written by the guy who wrote the originals. In both of their previous appearances, in Mothra and Mothra vs. Godzilla, the fairies were abused, mistreated, and victimized, forced against their will to perform on stage. Here, they're introduced in the story once again on stage, but this time they're voluntarily appearing before an appreciative audience because people genuinely want to hear what they have to say. And indeed, as the story progresses, they develop an action plan and take charge of the situation, rescuing others, fighting bad guys, ultimately proposing and enacting the very plan that will save the world. No victims, they. The Peanuts, also known as Emi and Yumi Ito, and for that matter, originally born Hideo and Tsukiko Ito, were a popular recording duo that began a professional singing career in 1959. Twins are for some reason especially rare in Japan, so they had this extra special hook along with their innate charm and talent. The Peanuts appeared in 10 movies in all before their retirement in 1975. Ghidrah marks their third and final appearance as Mothra's priestesses, so yeah, 30% of their entire movie career was spent singing to a giant moth. In addition to playing miniature women in science fiction thrillers, they were also adept at comedy. Their first comedy feature was distributed on the lower half of the double bill with King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, the year previously, Toho had signed the Peanuts up with a mind to fitting the pop idol somewhere into the world of giant monsters. Now, at this point, the studio was working out a co-production deal with Columbia Studios for Mothra. Now, seeing as how the Peanuts were on Columbia's label, it seemed smart to synergize, have the girls appear in Mothra so that Columbia could use the movie to publicize their first American album, and vice versa. For their initial appearance in Mothra in 1961, Shinichi Sekizawa wrote an outline of what kind of a song he had in mind, and then Ishiro Honda and a Malaysian college student wrote lyrics in a sort of pidgin Malay to sound foreign and exotic. Musician Yuji Koseki crafted a haunting lyrical tune, and movie history was made. For their reappearance here in Ghidrah, a new song was written, Cry for Happiness, by Hiroshi Miyagawa, the composer who'd worked with the twins on their earlier film Young Comrades. In the American version, dubbing supervisor Joseph Bellucci hired Annie Sukiyaki to read along with the song a vague English translation. My own attitude towards dubbing has changed over the years. When I wrote my book in the late 1990s, I was an adult fan of Godzilla who held a little boy's love of Godzilla in his heart. I wanted to be able to experience the original actors' performances, and even if I couldn't understand Japanese, I could connect the subtitle translations with the verbal qualities to appreciate at least a portion of the original performance that in dubbed versions was denied me. I decried dubbing as, even in its best iterations, a squalid practice undeserving of consideration. Godzilla movies like the works of Kurosawa and Mizoguchi and Nakagawa should be shown subtitled. What a pompous jerk I was! It took having kids for me to realize my error. I was at a megaplex screening of Fantasia 2000 with my daughter Anne, who was about 3 years old at the time, and a preview for Godzilla 2000 came on. Fantasia 2000, Godzilla 2000, I guess, the distributors felt if you liked your movies branded 2000, you'd be in the market for both. Well, anyway, Anne had never seen a Godzilla movie before. She didn't know anything about the character, but she leans over to me in the darkened theater and whispers, "Daddy, we see that movie, okay?" And we did, twice, she and I. Now, some Godzilla fans go apoplectic that Godzilla 2000 was dubbed instead of subtitled. They'll happily recite chapter and verse for you about all the errors or missteps Michael Schlesinger made in his dubbing script for the US theatrical version. But the simple fact is, if that film had been released only in a subtitled version, my daughter would not have been able to go and would never have become the Godzilla fan that she is. But if you want to talk about Godzilla fans in my family, my son Max is the ultimate. I mean, I'd assumed that I was, a bit of a fan. I'd gone to the bother of engaging a professional literary agent to sell my book about Godzilla to a scholarly press and then to spend the next few years yammering on about the subject for NPR audiences and college classes. But Max makes me look like an amateur, and he's just 5 years old. He probably should be the one doing this commentary, but he's only just now starting to read. In 2004, I took Anne to see the subtitled reissue of the original Godzilla on its theatrical run, but Max couldn't come because he couldn't read the subtitles. Now, before Max became a Godzilla fan, before he'd even been exposed, he got a present of some army toys, and he set out the little army men, their little tiny tanks, and he got out his plastic dinosaurs and proceeded to crush the army men under reptilian claws. This is a primal impulse, the allure of these giant monsters that once walked the earth but never alongside us, their inhuman features, the unreasonable scale of their hugeness compared to us, juxtaposed with our modern technology in all its glory. This is a universal thrill that transcends age and culture. If anything, it speaks louder to the children and the childish among us. Kids are drawn to this stuff by birthright, and the enormous commercial appeal of Godzilla flicks over the years bespeaks the mass audiences that they reached. I absolutely agree that in terms of film history, cinematic aesthetics, and cultural value, we should consider the Godzilla films in the same way that we consider Kurosawa. But it is asinine to narrowly draw the appeal of Godzilla movies in any way that excludes children. Dubbing, however much you may discredit the notion on aesthetic principles, opens up the doors to all those audience members who cannot or will not read subtitles. And if dubbing is a fact of life for the mass marketing of family-oriented action thrillers like these, we should at least have some standards about what constitutes good dubbing and what does not. Today's breed of fan is inclined to throw out all dubbing as equally suspect, and critics in the past shared that view. The Motion Picture Guide said of Ghidrah's dub job, quote, "A blind man could have done better." Well, I doubt that. By the time Toho cottoned on to the notion that American audiences actually liked seeing these movies, and they started counting on American distribution revenue, it became standard practice that Toho would commission an English-language dub during the initial production phase. Any foreign distributor that wanted to then had access to an already finished, ready-to-use English-language version. In the 1960s, American distributors took one look at these English-dubbed editions and said, "No thank you." That initial pass dubbing was often done by Hong Kong companies whose basic level of competence could be said to be mediocre. Sure, these editions match the Japanese editions in cutting and picture content and are indeed spoken in English. That's about all you can say about them. Most of the time, American distributors would take the films and redo the dubbing using American voice actors, producing a vastly superior vocal performance. However, during this process, the script might be rejiggered. Since words in one language do not necessarily correspond one-to-one with words in another language, the process of translating is a subjective art open to interpretation and vagaries of style. The extreme differences between English and Japanese grammar make that process of translation even more imprecise. And for dubbing to be reasonably unobtrusive, ideally you want the lip movements to match up more or less with the verbalized sounds, but the lip movements of the Japanese language are so far off from the sounds and speech patterns of English, creating a script that captures the meaning of the original dialogue and manages to stay in sync with the Japanese lip movements is a profound challenge. Now that said, the dubbing handled during the 1960s was often excellent. I'm personally a fan of the dubbed version of Ghidrah because the light touch of Sekizawa's character-based comedy and his more slapsticky moments both are expressed best to non-Japanese speaking audiences through the voice talents hired by Continental. But they didn't just hire actors to do the dubbing. The film was re-edited as well. The cuts fall into two separate categories. One, which we can call benign cuts, relate purely to the dubbing process. One of the reasons that the studio dub job sounds so much better and more convincing than the cheaper ones is that the studios would often cut the picture to match the new voices. A few frames here, a few seconds there, move a reaction shot from one place to another to cover up a line of English dialogue that couldn't be made to fit the lip movements. These changes never altered the basic stuff of the movie, but helped greatly to smooth out the new English language soundtracks in relation to the on-screen performances. The second category of edits was more intrusive. Much of the changes made to the US version have to do with advancing Ghidrah's arrival in the story to earlier in the film and generally tightening everything up by excising extraneous sequences that don't directly advance the plot. For example, during the opening sequence at the Space Observatory, a shot of Ghidrah's fireball crashing in the mountains was moved from later in the film to coincide with the meteor shower to more explicitly connect Ghidrah's arrival with the meteor storm and to make that opening sequence more exciting and ominous. Also, the American cut dropped a pair of scenes involving the press. Early in the film, Detective Shindo was originally introduced in the Japanese cut with a scene between him and a reporter, before Akihiko Harada's character showed up to assign Shindo to the princess. The Continental version drops this and skips a later scene with Naoko's press room discussing how to handle the prophetess story. Both versions include some ambiguous chronology regarding when Professor Murai is on the mountaintop investigating the meteorite and when he's back in town hanging out with Naoko, and how precisely he juts back and forth. The American cut, though, moves some scenes around so he only appears to leave the site once and then return, rather than leave it twice. For those who decry the American cut as an illegitimate tampering with the director's vision, I would like to enter into evidence Ghidrah Monster of Monsters, the 1969 reissue version of Ghidrah. A little background is perhaps in order. In 1969, there was this thing called the Champion Festival. It was a sort of summer camp for couch potatoes. It was a massive festival for kids where you'd go and sit and spend your day watching monster movies and superhero shows and cartoons. Oh man, to have been a kid in Tokyo in 1969. Well, anyway, Toho re-released 8 of the 1960s-era Godzilla movies, all directed by Ishiro Honda as part of this event. The movies had to be edited down to a little over an hour, around 70-75 minutes apiece, to fit the constraints of the festival. And to do the job, Ishiro Honda himself was tasked with overseeing the cuts. Okay, now here's the point I wanted to get to. Ishiro Honda's own personal recut of Ghidrah copied many of the cuts from the Continental version. There's almost no significant cut Honda made to the 1969 Monster of Monsters version that hadn't been anticipated by the Continental version. If anything, Honda was even more severe, since he hacked it down to 73 minutes, where the American version runs 85. Although American fans make this big deal about criticizing the various American recuts of Godzilla movies, Honda himself and the rest of the Japanese filmmakers never held those same negative opinions. In fact, it's startlingly easy to come up with quotes from Honda praising the American editions and coming out in favor of dubbing. And there are two reasons for this. One is the fact that the Japanese have cherished the notion that their culture is so distinctive and unique that it must, by definition, be inscrutable to outsiders. And so adapting their cultural products would be essential in order for those cultural products to be appreciated by foreigners. This remains a mindset even today among J-horror filmmakers who continue to believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that Americans could not enjoy truly Japanese horror. It would be too Japanese for them. But the real reason isn't that alterations were needed to strip away some of the Japaneseness. It was because these were family-friendly mass-market movies, and the only way to reach an all-ages mass audience abroad is if the hindrance of foreign language had been removed. Rodan first appeared on movie screens in 1956 in a freestanding monster flick, directed by Ishiro Honda with a touching screenplay by Takeshi Kimura. It was a quite successful film both in Japan and in America. However, for Rodan's re-emergence here, it was no longer possible to use the 1956 costume, which had rotted and been discarded long ago. But even if the 1956 Rodan suit had been available, it wouldn't have been right to use it. A lot of fans complain that compared to the prehistoric elegance of the original, the suit here just looks goofy. You know, comparisons to Don Knotts and Stan Laurel are not inappropriate. But you see, that's the whole point. The 1956 Rodan was a tragic creature, a monster modeled after King Kong as a noble savage out of place in the modern world. The 1964 Rodan is a slapstick character and should look the part. One of the American revisions occurs here, as the reporters ask the Peanuts about Godzilla's whereabouts before he's appeared on the scene. Fans often singled this out as a mistake, but I've never seen it in that light. Remember that Mothra's fairies are in town on the Where's Mothra tour, and that Mothra was last seen beating Godzilla up. It simply seems natural that you'd ask them, since they seem to be in the know, if, Godzilla's likely to be on the move anytime soon. In the U.S. press book promoting Ghidrah, director Ishiro Honda barely rates a mention, but Shinichi Sekizawa is profiled, maybe the only time that a Japanese screenwriter was singled out for attention in publicity of this sort. And of all the things they could have said about him, they described him as, quote, an expert on the extracurricular activities of delinquent monsters. Well, that pretty much says it all, doesn't it? I don't wish to downplay the importance of Ishiro Honda, but clearly Sekizawa was the one pulling this cart. Now, I haven't said much about Honda, in part because I'm confident that my colleagues on the commentary tracks for the other great Godzilla movies coming from classic media will certainly cover his career and aesthetic talents quite thoroughly, and I don't want to bore you any more than is strictly necessary. However, I will tell this story about Honda, my personal favorite story about his legacy. Now, when I set out to research my book, I found what purported to be an exhaustive and definitive survey of the history of Japanese cinema. In it, the author discussed Ishiro Honda, the friend and co-conspirator of Akira Kurosawa, who co-directed several of Kurosawa's classic art films. And then, the book also discussed, with less detail, Inoshiro Honda, the disreputable filmmaker behind Godzilla and the like. It had never occurred to this writer that they were, in fact, the same man. Inoshiro Honda is how his name is most often rendered in English on the title sequences of the American prints, but Ishiro was the man's preferred rendering. Although in the Western press, it is often said that Kurosawa's career revival in the 1980s was thanks to the intervention of Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas, Kurosawa himself gave that honor to Ishiro Honda, his longtime friend and occasional neighbor. Even if commentators in the West couldn't reconcile these two aspects, in Japan's film industry, the two biggest exports, Kurosawa art flicks and giant monster movies, all charted a course through the same man. Now, here's one place where comparing Ghidrah back against Mothra vs. Godzilla helps, because it lets us see where Sekizawa was directing his attention. On the one hand, He's taken the monsters, so noble, fearsome, and imposing in Mothra vs. Godzilla, and turned them into slapstick comedians. And then he's taken the women characters, victims and bumblers in the previous film, and given them pride of place. Take, for example, Yuriko Hoshi as the girl reporter Naoko. Back in Mothra vs. Godzilla, Hoshi was a supporting player cast as the incompetent photographer Junko. She was a Japanese Lucille Ball, too dim-witted even to remember to remove her lens cap. But in Ghidrah, Hoshi is a full-fledged reporter, a central heroine in a woman-positive story. If Hiroshi Koizumi is basically playing a repeat performance of his previous role, Hoshi is most decidedly a different woman altogether. Far from being the partner to a male reporter hero, she's on her own. And she's good at her job. In the original Japanese cut, her skills are even more pronounced. Instead of being assigned the story, she scoops her male colleagues on it. But whichever edition you watch, she manages to take charge of Princess Salno while her brother is the one bumbling around. Salno is played by the strikingly beautiful Akiko Wakabayashi, one of several actors pulling double duty with Ghidorah. In that other film, she played a hard-bitten femme fatale. Her co-star in Ghidorah, Robert Dunham, later said in an interview he thought she wasn't much of an actress, but had, in his words, a killer body. No argument on that latter point, but as for her thespian skills, I can but say she's only in a few scenes in Ghidorah, but you remember those scenes. Akiko Wakabayashi later appeared as a Bond girl in 1967's You Only Live Twice. The fifth outing for 007 was partly filmed in Japan at Toho Studio with a few regular Toho stars alongside Sean Connery, and that film features the immortal line, "In Japan, men always come first, women come second," moments before James Bond gets a full body massage from Akiko Wakabayashi. But that's a Western movie with a Westerner's fetish of what Japanese women are like. Akiko Wakabayashi sachets her killer body through both Ghidorah and Ghidrah, stealing Diamond's grubby clothes and scenes as she does, and would never be caught dead surrendering so submissively to a man. While emboldening all of the female roles, Sekizawa also uses the women characters as narrative devices to explain what the monsters are up to. Without Princess Salno to give it a name, we'd never know who or what Ghidrah is. Without the fairies to translate, we'd never know how Mothra persuaded Rodan and Godzilla to join the fight. And it's up to Naoko to give voice to these other, somewhat supernatural women whose warnings are not being heeded by the men. Along with the innovations of comedy and individualized monster personalities, this is another of Sekizawa's gifts to the genre. From this point onward, Toho's monster movies would often invoke women characters as agents for the monster's actions. Interestingly, Salno's mannish behavior coincides with her clothing choices. She discards her royal heritage and frilly dresses, arguably patriarchal symbols, to assert her own identity. She remains a forceful character only so long as she stays wearing men's clothes. Once Naoko gets her back in womanly attire, she becomes a retiring and meek figure carted around by the male characters. It's as if the clothes made the woman. Now, even if you think of yourself as something of a King Kong know-it-all, there are some aspects of that story relevant to what we're watching here that you might not have at your fingertips. There are some films so explosively original and groundbreaking that they unleash a torrent of imitators and wannabes, and in so doing lay claim to starting a new genre or subgenre. King Kong did this only at a considerable remove. A good 20 years elapsed before anything like it started to show up, and another 10 years after that before Kong-like flicks became common. In hindsight, it's easy to locate why King Kong didn't launch a bunch of wannabes right off the pitch. Problem number one was the extraordinarily specialized skill set of the technicians responsible for creating it. If you wanted to hire Willis O'Brien and his crew, their stop-motion animation process required a staggering investment of time and money. Which brings us neatly to problem number two. The thinking behind bandwagon jumpers and knockoffs is to reduce the inherent risk of film production. That logic is incompatible with increasing your risk by throwing money money into painstakingly meticulous special effects work. Eventually, the audience that sat enthralled in theaters watching King Kong in 1933 would grow up, and some of the youths inspired by that experience would take their places in the film industry ready to pay homage to Kong with their own contributions. But that would take, about 20 years. So we come to 1952, just shy of 20 years after the initial run of King Kong. This is back before TV had established itself as a serious player in people's lives, long before anything like the video industry existed to allow individual audience members to rent or buy movies at will. Back in the day, you wanted to see a movie, you had to see it in a theater, and if it wasn't playing, you couldn't see it. So the owners of King Kong were sitting on a property that had matured in value. A new generation of viewers had grown up hearing tales of this legendary flick, but had never seen it themselves. And those once awestruck kids had now grown up and harbored an intense nostalgic urge to revisit this beloved film. In the end, King Kong's rerun wound up not only besting the returns of its original past, but as one of the biggest box office draws of 1952 regardless. If it was painful for producers to pass up the opportunity to jump all over Kong's success in the 30s, it was nigh impossible to do so now. And now, that new generation of Kong-inspired filmmakers were available as a ready talent pool. For example, Ray Harryhausen. He'd studied the stop-motion technique under Willis O'Brien, and in 1953 established himself as the next big thing with Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It was written by science fiction author Ray Bradbury, himself a Kong baby come of age. H-bombs revive and enrage a long-dormant dinosaur mistakenly thought to be extinct. The creature brings its nuclear-powered rampage to the Big Apple, and special effects ensue. It was a hit, and the first of many Monster on the Loose thrillers to come, many with Cold War nuclear themes. With the exception of the usually prestigious Harryhausen stuff, though, most of the monster movies that started to flood into American theaters were low budget and low ambition, with crude special effects, lazy scripting, and rushed filmmaking the rules of the game. Giant Gila Monster, Amazing Colossal Man, The Deadly Mantis, Attack of the Crab Monsters. But on the other side of the world, King Kong's reach had extended even there and triggered a Japanese trend of monster movies. The cruel irony is how these lavishly appointed and genuinely well-made Japanese films came to be viewed in the West with such a jaundiced and prejudiced eye. But even if they didn't get critical respect, the Japanese monster boom was big business, and the cheap-jack American work couldn't compete. Think of it as outsourcing. Toho worked hard, paid its staff modestly, operated like a production line, and made popular stuff that dominated the market. Now, Eiji Tsuburaya, like Ray Bradbury, like Ray Harryhausen, was enthralled as a young man when Kong hit screens in the 30s, and it drove him into the career of special effects. While his life never accorded him much of an opportunity to duplicate the specific techniques used by Obi, he carried that inspiration with him throughout the techniques that he devised and pioneered for his own use. During pre-production for the first Godzilla, Tsuburaya made Haruo Nakajima watch King Kong twice to help him understand his assignment as the actor playing Godzilla. Now, what of King Kong versus Godzilla? It's kind of too bad that film wasn't part of this package from classic media, because it really could have used a commentary track to go through the tortuous, complex, absurd labyrinth that was its route from concept to screen. I'll digress to give you some quick high points here, because I feel like it. Obi's star had faded considerably in the days since Kong. He was a genius and a unique talent, but he needed some hefty financial backing to be able to stay in business, and producers weren't inclined to fork over cash when he came in, pitching the kinds of ideas that he tended to have. Few of his movies got made, frustration abounded, and eventually he found himself quite humiliated. Now, during this sad period, Obi worked up a treatment for a Kong sequel called King Kong vs. Frankenstein. Unlike most of his go-nowhere ideas, he managed to sell this one to John Beck, which got him some money but nothing else. Beck bought it off him lock, stock, and barrel, turned around and sold it to Toho. Toho saw this American project as a rare opportunity. Forget King Kong versus Frankenstein, let's have King Kong go at it with Godzilla, the two greatest movie monsters in monster movie history. And to make the whole thing even more attractive, this idea was so obviously commercial, Toho got Universal to pony up a significant chunk of change to pay for the production in return for US distribution rights. Now, there's a lot more to the King Kong vs. Godzilla story than we'll bother with here, but take these 2 points away. Number one, it was a huge hit, ultimately the biggest box office success in Godzilla history. And number two, it was a ludicrously silly film, deliberately funny in a way that no monster movie before it had ever attempted anywhere in the world. Now, as we continue, I'm going to try to point out major edits between the various versions. One purpose of the American cuts had to do with the personalities of Godzilla and Rodan. Toho in general, and Sekizawa in particular, are changing the characters of these once dreaded forces of mindless destruction into more or less heroic figures, defenders of Earth, the good guys. This movie stands at a crucial transition point. With few exceptions, Godzilla would be from now on the hero of his movies, even in the more adult-themed serious ones of the 1990s onwards. The American cut tries to help that process along a tad by not having us in the audience feel too uncharitably towards the monsters in the first half of the film, before Mothra recruits them into a band of brothers. In the Japanese cut, Godzilla tramples ashore and engages in willful property damage for no apparent reason, his modus operandi from the previous films. Once ashore, he spies Rodan in the air and decides to spend most of the rest of the film fighting him. The US cut yanks a clip of Rodan back to when Godzilla first reared his head out of the water, to motivate his rampage right from the beginning as a rivalry with Rodan. It softens his character slightly for his violence to at least be motivated rather than random. And here we are at one of the most significant alterations wrought on the US recut. In the original Japanese theatrical release, Ghidrah does not emerge from the fireball until after Princess Salno has prophesized it, whereas the US cut brings it forward to occur at the halfway point in the film, right after Godzilla and Rodan begin to engage. One can see the logic behind the change, get the titular menace into the movie as soon as possible. Critics of the US cut often point to the fact that the change weakens Salno's standing as a prophet, and rightly ask just what it is Ghidrah spends his time with after breaking free of the meteorite, before he gets around to attacking Matsumoto City, whereas the original cut goes directly from Ghidrah's birth to his rampage. However, in defense of the US recut, let me point out the following. Godzilla fights Rodan at night. Salno makes her prophecy in broad daylight. Ghidrah attacks Matsumoto City in broad daylight. Yet Ghidrah's birth on the mountaintop here is clearly staged at nighttime. It was a continuity error, something that Honda tried to cover up by having Ghidrah's birth from the fireball fade out so the abrupt switch in lighting doesn't seem so obvious. By changing the order of scenes around, the US cut has Godzilla and Rodan fighting at night, Ghidrah emerges later that night, following morning all hell breaks loose, continuity problem solved, and Ghidrah enters the film at the earliest possible point. I'm not sure if it'll be on this DVD as one of the extras, but there is another take of this effect, which is arguably superior, but for some reason Tsuburaya selected this one, which would then be recycled as stock footage pretty much every time Ghidrah reappears in future movies. Here we get a brief appearance by one of Japan's most venerated actors, the distinguished Takeshi Shimura. For his role in Akira Kurosawa's Ikaru in 1952, the New York Times called him the best actor in the world. A few years later, when he played Dr. Yamane in Godzilla, the same reviewer in the same paper said none of that film's cast could act. Shimura proceeded to appear in both Kurosawa's art house flicks such as Seven Samurai and Redbeard, and Honda's sci-fi epics like Ghidrah and Frankenstein Conquers the World. The Western media, so eager to draw a bright line between serious cinema and commercial trash, didn't know what to do with this and so tried to ignore it. It was a career path we've already seen with Yoshio Tsuchiya, who was unable to appear in Ghidrah because of his commitment to Redbeard. Shimura was also on Redbeard but managed to take a day off to shoot his one scene here. Eiji Tsuburaya, like so many of the folks associated with Godzilla, started off training for a completely different career. He went to flight school and then studied electrical engineering. And he put that training to use, oddly enough, as a screenwriter for what would become Kokatsu Studios. And it was there, during the silent movie era, that he started to learn the craft of special effects. I say started because he was drafted into the Imperial Army and served from 1921 to 1923. When he returned to civilian life, he joined up with Shochiku in their art department in the late 1920s, and there he befriended Akira Watanabe, the designer with whom he would work on Toho's special effects extravaganzas 4 decades later. Although he was learning about the techniques of special effects, the Japanese film industry still had little use for such things. There was an attitude at the time that trick effects were just that. They were tricks, cheating, something dishonest. So when Tsuburaya saw King Kong in the 1930s, it opened up a whole new world to him, the possibility of embracing special effects for their own sake and building entire movies around them. By 1936, he was a full-fledged special effects director and was headhunted by the company that would come to be known as Toho. They put him to work on war films, leading to a somewhat notorious point in Tsuburaya's career. It's said that his recreation of Zero planes dive-bombing Pearl Harbor was so convincing that after the war, the American Army believed the footage to be genuine, when in fact it was miniatures and wireworks. After a stint freelancing, Tsuburaya returned to Toho in the 1950s and started collaborating with Ishiro Honda on several films, one of which was, Godzilla. By this point, he was regularly receiving awards and was fast becoming a celebrity in his own right. The Big Pool was constructed on Toho's lot in 1959 under Tsuburaya's direction. It's 43,000 square feet in size, 262 feet wide at its widest point, 210 feet deep at its deepest. There's a 46-foot-high concrete wall serving as the sky, which can be painted as needed depending on the shoot. Electric motors generate artificial waves, and since water can't be miniaturized, to help disguise the scale of the water, Tsuburaya would work in the largest scale miniatures he could manage and film at fast frame rates so the action would be slowed down, lending a sense of gravity and size. Unfortunately for the crew, actual, real live fish lived in the tank despite all attempts to remove them, and between the fish and real bugs that were attracted to the water, nature had a way of intruding in and ruining many an expensive shot. Coming up, you can actually see the edge of the tank as Godzilla fights Rodan. Tsuburaya tried to hide the mistake by superimposing some trees over it. Take a look at the lower right-hand side of the screen right now and see how well you think he did. Back in 1956, Haruo Nakajima was the actor inside the Rodan suit. A stuntman and actor trained at the International Movie Actors Studio, and a credited on-screen player in such films as Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, Haruo Nakajima is best known for his performance as Godzilla. He couldn't play both parts in this film, so he stuck with the starring role as Godzilla. Nakajima's usual understudy, Katsumi Tezuka, had taken the gig as Mothra, so to fill the Rodan suit, they got actor Masashi Shinohara. Now, in the original Japanese release version, the sequence at the Diet Building as the Japanese legislature debates how to respond to their monsterific dilemma is actually two separate scenes interrupted by a bit of Godzilla and Rodan duking it out. The American version cuts and pastes that Godzilla versus Rodan bout to just after the Diet sequence. This is the last significant cut made by the American editors, and it is another one of the cuts that Ishiro Honda duplicated in his 1969 Monster of Monsters edition. Honda recognized the value of streamlining the Diet debate into a coherent whole, emphasizing Ghidrah as the primary threat to humanity and showing Godzilla and Rodan's battle more as pointless roughhousing between giant monster toddlers than as a serious menace to the planet. But whereas most of the American cuts do make sense to me, and I've even made a point of coming out and defending them to you, knowing full well that a lot of hardcore Godzilla fans are listening who are not inclined to agree with me, there is one major change in the US version that I cannot defend and do not understand at all. I just can't wrap my head around why the American editors replaced so much of Akira Ifukube's music with stock library cues. Ifukube was such an integral part of the tapestry of Godzilla's world that his music became iconic in and of itself. In 1998, to promote the release of the TriStar-produced American Godzilla, Matthew Broderick was the guest host on Saturday Night Live. In his opening monologue, the rest of the cast interrupts him with various Godzilla trivia, which descends into humming Ifukube's themes. I mean, we're talking here about a Japanese composer whose music is such a part of international pop culture that his compositions, hummed, could be used as a punchline on Saturday Night Live. Ifukube is the only Japanese classical composer to get any serious consideration or mention in English-language texts. And if you manage to track down one of his classical CDs, you'll find it eerily familiar to his soundtrack music. The guy scored 200 feature films in 60 years. It was inevitable that he would recycle and revamp musical cues given such a crushing workload. In fact, the signature theme for Ghidrah in this film was a piece originally scored in 1958 for Varan. But Ifukube had enough originality in him to continue to mine new ideas and new themes right up into his final soundtrack recorded in 1995. Despite this, much of Ifukube's musical setting for Ghidrah is missing from the English-language print. Nevertheless, I'm really happy that Classic Media saw fit to restore the edited US version for this DVD. In recent years, DVD editions of Toho special effects films have made a priority of restoring the original Japanese editions subtitled, something so longed for by fans. But as I said earlier, the altered US versions presented, in part as a consequence of their alterations, a superior English-language dubbing job. The Hong Kong dubs, commonly referred to as international versions, weren't generally available in the US for the 1960s-era films. It is a good thing that the DVD age has brought with it a widespread commercial availability of the uncut Japanese originals, but I'm loath to see the edited US versions disappear altogether. For viewers like my son Max, the ability to fall in love with these films the way I did as a child is slowly being curtailed in favor of catering to an audience of adult fans. At least this disc preserves the Continental version, warts and all, for posterity. Now, I haven't said much about Tomoyuki Tanaka, the most prolific producer of fantasy entertainment in cinema history. He was a business major who started at Toho as a cameraman. See, I told you people tended to skip around between unrelated positions. Tanaka eventually became a producer in 1945. In 1952, he headed a seminal drama called Farewell Rabaul. I say seminal because although the movie itself isn't all that well remembered, it united in one production Tomoyuki Tanaka, Shiro Honda, Eiji Tsuburaya, and actor Akihiko Hirata. In other words, the production team that 2 years later would launch Godzilla. Tanaka continued to head up all of Toho's most notable science fiction and fantasy productions throughout the 1960s and 70s and stayed at the helm of the Godzilla franchise until 1995. I talked earlier about some of the parallels and similarities between Ghidorah and Ghidrah, but one key overlap I left out and want to bring up now is that in previous monster movies, the ritual destruction of Japanese cities by giant creatures is a direct and visceral experience. I'm not the only commentator to connect that ritualized destruction with memories of World War II, Allied firebombing and nuclear bombs alike. Honda even admitted that Godzilla's atomic breath was a conscious attempt to render the horror of nuclear radiation in starkly visual terms. For an island nation like Japan, continually beset by natural disasters like volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and the like, the kinds of devastation caused by fictional monsters can easily be seen as a bigger metaphor. But in Ghidorah and Ghidrah both, something new is added to the mix. A city that appears to tear itself apart thanks to the invisible aftershocks of a monster passing overhead. One useful consequence of this sort of effects work is that it could be fairly easily transplanted into other films as recycled footage because the monster isn't seen on screen at the same time as the damage. It could be used for just about any old monster. Now, 1964 was the year of the Tokyo Olympics, a major moment in Japanese history where a once exclusionary and isolated country opened its doors to the world to show off, among other things, the astounding economic and political advances made since the end of World War II. It was the first year that the bullet train was first unveiled, and the year of China's first nuke. In other words, 1964 saw Japan reaching out with open arms and considerable pride to a brave new world full of promise and of great menace. This is a family-oriented action thriller, so I don't want to lay any heavy baggage on it that doesn't belong, but under the surface of movies like this, it isn't hard to see that national zeitgeist. This film is about how Japan faces and survives the greatest threat to the planet in history, because people and monsters alike are able to reach out across their differences and work together in a spirit of harmony and mutual brotherhood. For a bunch of filmmakers bruised and shaken by their wartime experiences, it's a happy thought. In my book, I had suggested that Ghidrah could be interpreted as a symbol of China, a Chinese mythical dragon that speaks in multiple voices and cannot be trusted, but I've come around to thinking that that really is putting too much baggage on the film. Shinichi Sekizawa invented the name Ghidrah, or is it Ghidorah, or King Ghidorah? The original English name was Ghidrah, but later English dubbing used the name King Ghidorah, and Toho now stipulates Ghidorah as the preferred rendering. But here's the deal. The Japanese alphabet is made up of characters that are either isolated vowel sounds or are consonant-vowel pairings. There are no isolated consonants. In other words, written Japanese cannot end a word in a consonant or have two consonants abut one another. Now, I specify written Japanese because in practice, Japanese speakers talk very fast, and those connective vowel sounds are often aspirated or swallowed up entirely, even if technically they're there. So a word written out as Ghidorah would end up spoken quickly as Ghidrah, hence the confusion. The character for Ra is the same one that ends so many of these monster names: Ghidrah, Hedorah, Ebirah, Mothra, Gamera. Why, it's even the character at the end of Godzilla, or Gojira if you're speaking Japanese. There's a change here between the American dubbing and the original version, which I want to flag. In the Japanese edition, Princess Salno claims to be from the planet Venus, whereas the English soundtrack has her from Mars. I wish I could explain to you the logic behind that switch, but the decision-making process has not been recorded for posterity, so the best I could do would be to offer up a wild guess. I can, however, say that regardless of where she says she's from, the underlying idea that people are descended from aliens is not new to Sekizawa's script. There's a theory popular among some pseudoscientific communities that astronauts from other worlds had contact with primitive man in ways that influenced our evolutionary development and our culture. The most popular proponent of this theory was author Eric von Däniken, whose 1968 bestseller Chariots of the Gods inspired a host of science fiction adaptations of his ideas. But the notion was surfacing in print as far back as 1919. In the 1950s, Nigel Neal based his Quatermass in the Pit story on this idea, positing that Homo sapiens descended from apes who had been tampered with by Martian colonists, and that some people retained more of their Martian heritage than others, giving them paranormal powers. More recently, the X-Files ran with the same idea. Sekizawa's version is notable for being one of the earliest screen versions of this idea, with Salno tapping into some long-dormant alien heritage, a forgotten race memory of Ghidrah's violence, and the unfeminine self-confidence that carries her through her travails. Ghidrah and aliens just seem to go together for some reason. In almost all of his subsequent screen appearances, Ghidrah is the slave of alien conquerors. This may be due to the fact that, in and of himself, the monster is somewhat characterless, and needs external humanoid personas to carry much narrative weight. Eiji Tsuburaya was disappointed when he shot Ghidrah's scenes because what had seemed so impressive as an abstract design was in its physical realization awkward and delicate. It looked great on the page, but on the set the Ghidrah suit was virtually immobile. The finished film looks far better than Tsuburaya's comments suggest. He was clearly frustrated by the experience, and it wounded his perfectionist pride. Which may explain why Ghidrah has such limited screen time. There are some Godzilla fans who review the movies with a reductionist emphasis on measuring monster scenes versus non-monster or narrative scenes to see which movie has the better proportion. By this calculus, Ghidrah comes up wanting, with fewer special effects sequences than Mothra vs. Godzilla the previous year. If that's what you're looking for, you may be interested in the Godzilla Fantasia from the early 1990s, which took Akira Ifukube's music and simply illustrated it music video style with clips from the monster battles, all pesky story-based scenes removed for your comfort and pleasure. It's easy to separate the monster battles from the storyline because they do feel at times fairly disconnected. Footage from the climactic final contest between Godzilla and Rodan and Ghidrah would be reused in Destroy All Monsters and Godzilla vs. Gigan, and for that matter, was recycled within this very film with clips pulled out of context to provide the backdrop for the opening title sequence. Of course, what Shinichi Sekizawa was railing against all along was this whole dichotomy of human scenes versus monster scenes, and he wanted to integrate them together into a new kind of storytelling. But since the traditional approach was to pit humans versus monsters, and he recast it as human versus human and monster versus monster, the end result feels more split. Scenes like this one demonstrate his approach to unification. Salno's in trouble, and she is saved, because Rodan comes along and drops Godzilla on the power lines and kills the electricity at the critical moment. Sekizawa's self-imposed mission to fill Godzilla movies with jokes met up against the resistance of Honda, who wasn't keen on allowing the monsters to be humanized to such a degree. Honda said, "I don't think a monster should ever be a comical character." Now you could ask, how come Honda, the god of Japanese science fiction movies, one of the most commercially successful Japanese filmmakers of all time, didn't have the clout to prevent changes he didn't agree with? Guy Tucker noted that, had he been working in Hollywood, a director of such box office power would have been able to write his own ticket, but the top-down factories of Japanese studios didn't play like that. I love this bit during the fight, where they smack the guy over the head with the wrench and it doesn't knock him out, it only hurts him. Right there. Man, you know, movie fights are usually so unrealistic, one punch to someone's jaw and bang, they're unconscious, but then you watch boxing matches and you see that the human body can actually endure a lot of punishment and mistreatment without giving out. It's a great slapstick joke here, it's funny, but it also adds a little degree of realism into the situation. Not enough filmmakers are sensitive to those little details these days, and it's one more sign of the careful attention Honda and his team brought to these productions. Godzilla movies were not the only once serious pop cultural products that were becoming campy and humorous in the 1960s. Indeed, it's hard to find one that wasn't. The Dark Knight of Bob Kane's Batman comics became one of the funniest comedies on American television, while England's The Avengers recast the 007 James Bond tropes as a platform for absurdist humor. Francis Phantomus, a chilling figure from silent thrillers of the turn of the century, returned as a wildly silly action character in films that were cut from the Pink Panther mold. Pop cultural anthropologists who study this kind of thing say that camp, as a style, tends to arise out of societies that have suddenly increased their standard of living and generated enormous amounts of disposable wealth very quickly, while the general level of cultural sophistication has not had a chance to develop at the same pace. This happened in the United States during the 1950s and 60s, with a huge economic boom enriching a population that didn't yet include all that many college graduates. The principal examples of American camp emerged from that period. The Japanese economic miracle similarly put their economy into overdrive during the mid-60s and 1970s, coinciding with a vast outpouring of camp comedy from Japan during that period, of which Godzilla is merely a part. Now, throughout this commentary, I've continually returned to this myth. It is said that little by little, a silliness and an irreverence crept in that was a kind of artistic corruption. Call it the cancer of camp. And once established, it took over the form until Godzilla movies were too ridiculous to survive, and the franchise died out in 1975. But to say that comedy is inimical to Godzilla's true nature, or that comedy is the cause of dwindling box office receipts, is simply an untenable position. It's sure a popular one among a lot of fans, but saying it don't make it so. During the period 1954 to 1959, when Toho was making science fiction fantasy of the most serious stripe, they put out just 6 movies we'd consider truly related in some way to Godzilla. They had the field all to themselves. Take a comparable period a decade later, 1964 to 1969, and by this point, Toho puts out almost double as many special effects spectaculars, 11 movies up from 6. And that doesn't even take into account the extensive competition in the mid-1960s from other Japanese studios finally joining the game. This is a standard operating procedure in the Japanese film industry. If you have a popular brand, you make a lot of product so as to distribute the risk better. The individual films may be less likely to be blockbusters to the same degree as when they were facing little or no competition, but if you make 6 movies and 1 or 2 of them are gigantic hits, you've got more at risk than if you make 11 movies and all of them are modest hits. So you go from having 3 Godzilla movies in 8 years to having 2 in the same year. And at the same time, other popular series were working under similar paths. There were 8 entries in the Boss series that year, for example. When Godzilla movies stopped production in 1975, they were returning much smaller amounts than the heyday of the 1960s, but they were still turning profits in Japan. But the exhibition venues in the United States that had been a critical component of the revenues were drying up. Drive-ins were closing, distribution chains once dedicated to genre films were disappearing. By the mid to late 1970s, you find that most of the once robust fantasy genres of the 1960s had hit hard times. Hammer horrors, Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe cycle, spaghetti westerns, blaxploitation films, kung fu chopsakis, they were all closing up shop in the 1970s. By that point, Hollywood's studio system was overtaken by a new generation of filmmakers with an entirely different attitude about pulp movies. For years, genre filmmaking had been primarily something done by indies and B-movie makers, outsiders. Suddenly, in the mid to late 1970s, big Hollywood started making genre films, and making them very well. A new age of blockbusters was ushered in with Jaws, Star Wars, Alien, and Superman leading the way. In their heyday in the 1960s, Toho's science fiction spectacles had been extremely competitive, with higher production values and greater entertainment than the low-budget American Drek of the same category. But in the face of the juggernauts of Star Wars and the like, the world of genre film was being co-opted by the big studios. To put it simply, it almost doesn't matter what kind of Godzilla movie Toho was making in 1975. I just want to take that oft-repeated canard of conventional wisdom, "'twas silliness that killed the beast," and put a big fat question mark next to it. The forces that drove the Godzilla series up and down over the years worked independently of the actual content of the films, such that the relative merits of the movies, their respective tones and moods, their special effects and camp elements, would not have greatly altered the basic pattern. And there's no point in being willfully blind to just how much absurd comedy, surrealism, and joyful silliness underlies almost the entire history of the genre. That joyful silliness is part of what sets these movies apart from the formulaic work done by Western filmmakers of the same era, and a powerful component of how the monster characters were given identities. We perceive Godzilla as a character, like a James Bond or even a Charlie Chaplin, a screen persona. The very traits that some fans find so disagreeable in Ghidrah are the ones that make Godzilla unique. And so we come to the infamous monster talk sequence. Sekizawa's development of his female characters pales in comparison to the unprecedented humanization he here applies to the monsters. The whole conversation echoes the Brotherhood of Man theme from the previous film, Mothra vs. Godzilla. In that movie, the Japanese heroes travel to Mothra's island to plead with Mothra's people to overlook their past conflicts and grudges and find a common humanity. Now Mothra takes that very same argument to Godzilla and Rodan, arguing for a brotherhood of monsters. Thanks to Mothra's intervention, Godzilla is changing from a villain into a hero. I was on an NPR call-in show once and was asked how to explain the shifting back and forth of whether Godzilla is a heroic defender of the Earth or a destructive menace, and I said he was like Japan itself, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always acting on the same underlying principle, the defense of its territory. Depending on against what that territory is being defended, at times put Japan on the wrong side of various global conflicts. And in 1964, it was still a pressing and current issue of how to reconcile patriotism and nationalism and self-pride in Japan with being honest about the destructive military aggression that Japan had had in the war. Perhaps in some way the fictional construct of Godzilla helped provide a metaphor for that process to show that great forces can have both good and bad effects in the world without being all of one or the other. Ghidrah drops some rocks on the assassins here, even if only unintentionally, in a gag duplicated intact from Ghidorah. In that film, the space monster sends an avalanche of boulders onto the diamond theme, same difference. This is a raised set so that the cameras could be positioned low compared to the monster actors to help give the proper sense of scale. This set for the base of Mount Fuji took 12,000 man-hours to build. That's 500 man-days, or nearly 1.5 man-years. And it's just one of the miniature sets seen in the film. So all of you griping about how these landscapes were simpler to do than urban miniatures, put that in your pipe and smoke it. It was built on a 1/25th scale with actual bonsai trees and small plants mixed in with fake ones to create the foliage. Those miniature buildings have actual working sliding doors and working lights. They were built only to be seen from one direction. They don't have backs. The ones that were intended to be crushed by the monsters were pre-cut and stressed to break in specific, predictable ways. They were simply too sturdy to go up to and step on and have them break apart realistically that way. The ones that weren't supposed to break could be reused, repositioned in later setups on other sets. Now, back in the olden times, before DVD, before home video at all, if you wanted to have a copy of a movie, you bought it as a cut-down edited film on 8mm or Super 8 movie film. In the 1970s, magazines like Famous Monsters were filled with ads for these Ken films or Castle films or what have you, 8mm versions. And you'd have to save up your allowance to be able to afford one, which would then be just about 3 minutes or so of a movie in black and white and usually without sound. One of my prized possessions from my childhood is the Ken Films edition of Ghidrah. It's 3 minutes long and there's no sound. Of course, it's this big monster battle, and what I discovered is that if you watch the monster fights without sound, they come off even funnier than normally. There's something about Ifukube's grand music and the sound effects that gives this sense of pomposity and importance to what is actually staged as very slapsticky action. If you want to, turn down the volume and watch the fight scene silent. I think you'll be surprised. Tsuburaya responded to the comic screenplays by allowing greater amounts of comedy into the effect sequences, but his principal understudy, Teruyoshi Nakano, also resisted that change of tone. Stuart Galbraith interviewed Nakano, who said, quote, "The first Godzilla had such a social impact because Godzilla was the aftermath of the bomb. I wasn't sure if it could be turned into something that was entertaining and comical. But commercially, it was very successful, and after that, the Godzilla series became one monster versus monster movie after another. But it was totally opposite to what the first film was about. It was a little confusing to me, it had been hard, but after that, Godzilla movies became soft." Nakano would succeed Tsuburaya and take over the Toho special effects department at the end of the decade. And ironically, he would then preside over the most campy and absurd Godzilla movies ever made, because by then, the changes wrought by Sekizawa and Tsuburaya had become ironclad company policy. Sekizawa exerted an unprecedented level of involvement and influence in the creation of what was to become Toho's second most popular monster. He went to Tsuburaya personally to advocate for the use of lighter-weight silicon-based materials in the manufacture of the suit so that the actor inside could move more easily, facilitating more energetic fight sequences. This level of collusion was unusual, and it grew out of Sekizawa's genuine enthusiasm for his job. He loved doing these movies and wanted them to be the best they could be, so he disregarded the conventional boundaries of what a writer's role was. All across the board at Toho, these great filmmakers were each in their own way ambitious, eager to stretch their horizons, determined to top themselves. In 1962, Tsuburaya flew out to Hollywood to tour American studios, visit their special effects departments, and see what ideas and inspirations he could bring back home to Toho. He returned convinced that Toho should shell out for an Oxbury optical printer, an expensive yet vital piece of equipment with which he could substantially improve the shaky substandard quality of blue screen mats. It was such a hard sell to the studio, however, that Tsuburaya realized he was just a cog in the machine, and another of the ideas he came back with was the decidedly American notion of striking out on one's own. And so within a year, he founded his own company, Tsuburaya Productions, a for-hire special effects firm, within which he could invest in the equipment and techniques he thought appropriate, without having to get outside approval. By 1966, Tsuburaya Productions was making a mildly popular TV series called Ultra Q, a sort of precursor to The X-Files, with a team of paranormal specialists called upon week after week to confront, you guessed it, giant monsters. The series offered Tsuburaya a platform to try out various ideas and techniques that he would then port over to Toho's effects spectaculars in more refined form. It was also a source of money that was his, and that revenue stream started to flood when Ultra Q evolved into a bigger and more popular series, Ultraman. Ultraman was a small-screen condensation of the final reels of Ghidrah. That is, every week the show would put together a new excuse for guys in rubber suits to wail on each other. Eiji Tsuburaya passed away in 1970, but Tsuburaya Productions lives on, as does Ultraman. The relationship between Tsuburaya Productions and Toho was fairly incestuous at first, with lots of overlap between personnel and materials. For example, the very first episode of Ultra Q featured a monster that, in all honesty, was Godzilla. They called it Gomez, but rather than design and build a new Gomez monster, Tsuburaya's team took the costume used in Ghidrah and added some tusks and some body plating, stuck a horn on its head, and rolled cameras. This seems as good a time as any to discuss the long history of this particular Godzilla suit. If you've seen more than one Godzilla movie in your life, you've likely noticed he looks different each time. The costumes just didn't last. During filming on a stage that burned at 170 degrees under blazing studio lamps as the actors smashed into model buildings, pummeled each other, and endured various trick explosions, the suits were destined to suffer some damage. Whenever they were used in the water tank, the damage was only compounded, and the rubber couldn't survive long in storage without rotting, so the team was obliged to manufacture a new suit every year or two. So the monster costumes were individually handmade, which meant that each new rendition would exhibit different characteristics than the last. In 1964, for Godzilla's 2 film appearances that year, a suit was made to replace the unusable one last seen in King Kong vs. Godzilla 2 years previously. Mr. Toshimitsu was the hands-on supervisor of this process, and he started by sketching the Godzilla suit at full-size scale on a sheet of plywood. From that life-size design, the body was constructed a wire frame to hold the contours of the shape and a fabric skin stuffed with foam. On top of that understructure, an outer skin of latex rubber textured to be bumpy and alligator-like was added. Throughout this process, the actor Haruo Nakajima was often obliged to wear the unfinished thing so that it could be form-fitted to his body. Nakajima even went above and beyond the call of duty. Like Sekizawa, he felt personally invested in the enterprise, so he'd routinely put on the unfinished suit and wrestle around in it to find problem areas and weak points before it was finalized. That way, the suit builders could be confident that it would endure the stresses of filming. Stresses like these. Inside all the layers of rubber and foam, the suit would reach temperatures of 130 degrees. The total weight of the costume was somewhere above 200 pounds. Nakajima could only bear wearing the thing for short bursts of time and would have to take frequent breaks. He would suffer severe muscle cramps from moving under the weight of all that, and on average would lose 20 pounds per film. This was a grueling job. The head was built like a sort of hat that Nakajima would wear. He could see, well, sort of, through tiny eye holes puncturing the suit's neck, while a hard plastic head was braced on top of his own. He entered the suit through an opening on the back, which would be hidden by the application of the spiky dorsal fins. In the end, the whole deal was painted black. Yeah, not green. Look at the screen if you don't believe me. It was painted black. It took up to 3 months to build just one monster suit. Now, during filming on Mothra vs. Godzilla, Nakajima slipped and crashed into one of the model buildings, dislodging the foam cheeks inside the suit's head. For the suit's second outing later that year, Toshimitsu's suit-building team decided to renovate the damaged head. They added radio-controlled eyeballs where the head previously held glassy-looking painted wooden eyes. The mechanics in the process of installing them flattened out the head a bit for its appearance in Ghidrah. Although the suit had been used in the water tank somewhat, it had not suffered unduly and managed to survive in storage better than some of its cousins. This is partly because, rather than being left to rot, it was used in various public appearances and publicity outings, the first time ever that a Godzilla costume was exhibited to the public in this way. In later years, the special effects unit would manufacture cheaper, cruder suits expressly for public appearances rather than use one of the actual filming suits. In 1966, when Tsuburaya launched Ultra Q, he was able to refit the remnants of the 1964 Godzilla suit with some add-ons to turn it into Gomez. Miraculously, the suit managed to survive even that process, and in 1967, when Ultraman started, the suit was hauled out of storage once again. The head was unusable by this point after having been Gomezized with the horn and fangs, so Tsuburaya yanked the head off the 1965 Godzilla suit, stuck it on the battered remains of the 1964 body, glued on a frilly neck to hide the joint, and called the thing Ghidrah. And after that, they threw the 1964 suit away. The Mothra larva costume here is one of 2 props left over from the previous film. Believe it or not, there's actually a performer all cramped up inside the thing, the experienced monster actor Katsumi Tezuka. Now, with its golden skin, Ghidrah certainly does seem like a Chinese dragon statue come to life, but dragon mythology was also important in Japan's history, and the original design for the creature called for rainbow-colored wings, not golden. In fact, Ghidrah's design owed more to Japanese mythological heritage than to anything Chinese. I've already mentioned the involvement of Sekizawa in the design of Ghidrah, but really the applause and credit should go to Akira Watanabe. He based his brilliant design on a relatively similar creation he'd cooked up back in 1959 for a film called The Three Treasures. This was a historical fantasy chronicling the myth of Japan's creation and featured an 8-headed dragon called Orochi. Ghidrah is an even more striking design with its golden scales and vast wings. The immensely popular monster would have starring roles in a total of 8 movies between 1964 and 2004 and make very brief cameo appearances in 4 others. The actor inside the suit was Shoichi Hirose, aka Solomon Hirose. He was a burly man's man who'd started his suitmation career in 1962 playing King Kong opposite Nakajima as Godzilla. Like Nakajima, he was versed in both judo and karate, and like Nakajima, his ability to use those techniques on screen was limited by the extraordinary circumstance of having 180 pounds of rubber caked around his body. As Ghidrah, Solomon Hirose was even more compromised. Inside the body of the suit, he was hunched over, grasping a bar for balance. The various wings and heads were all operated like marionettes by a team of puppeteers manipulating wires. If he moved too quickly or in the wrong direction, the wires would get tangled up with one another. Even if he moved with precision, sometimes the wires got caught in the scales of Ghidrah's golden skin. The whole endeavor was so complicated it took much longer to film Hirose's scenes for Ghidrah than it had for Kong, even though he had much less screen time. Ultimately, Hirose had overall less screen time in Toho's special effects extravaganzas than he'd wished because he ticked off old man Tsuburaya. Nakajima, you see, was a loyal company man committed to giving more than was asked, ever obedient to Tsuburaya. Hollywood had come knocking on Nakajima's door offering him work in America. Before accepting, he asked Tsuburaya's opinion. The old man was adamant, "We can't do this without you," and so Nakajima turned Hollywood down. However, Hirose didn't feel obliged to hook his career star exclusively to Tsuburaya's, and he accepted an offer for work on another studio's movie in Japan, and for this act of selfish betrayal, he was blackballed. Tsuburaya never hired Hirose again, instead replacing him in future movies with Hiroshi Sakida. Hirose had never been one to follow Tsuburaya's advice too closely. The old man had sent Nakajima to the zoo back in 1954, ordering him to study the movements of lions and bears, to study for his role as Godzilla. When Solomon Hirose joined them to play King Kong, Tsuburaya again said, "Get thee to a zoo." Hirose showed up on the set ready to work, and Tsuburaya asked him, had he studied the gorilla's movements as asked? Hirose lied and said he had. He didn't feel obliged either to do the task or to accurately report whether or not he had. Nakajima was the highest paid of Toho's Suitmation monster actors, and it was generally agreed upon that his performance, his acting, was crucial towards making Godzilla a star. When Tsuburaya died too young in 1970, a chain-smoking diabetic felled by a heart attack, Nakajima almost lost the will to live, certainly lost the will to work. He was coaxed back into a rubber suit only by the pleadings of Taisho Arakawa, the man initially charged with filling Tsuburaya's post. But when Toho's top brass refused to allow Honda to add a dedication to Tsuburaya on the closing credits of Space Amoeba, Taisho Arakawa was so disgusted he quit. Honda virtually retired at that point too. Nakajima stayed on for another 2 films and then called it quits along with most of the other principal creative team that had led the science fiction spectacles through the 1950s and 60s. The special effects films made by Toho in the 1970s would be handled by a new generation of filmmakers. It is only with hindsight that we can look back on a coherent Godzilla franchise. When Ghidrah was made, there was no reason to suspect that the Godzilla character would appear in decades more films. In the decade between 1954 and 1964, it was simply a question of Toho's executives discovering that, hey, our people are really good at this, and these kind of movies sell well abroad, so let's keep on making them while the getting's good. But within those parameters, it was not yet the case that anyone had decided to prioritize Godzilla features over other special effects showcases. There were space epics like Battle in Outer Space and Gorath. There were brooding sci-fi head-scratchers like The Human Vapor and Matango. There were action thrillers like Atragon or other giant monsters, Varan, Rodan, Mothra, Dogora. What happened was that Mothra and King Kong vs. Godzilla so far outstripped the other productions in popularity, it forced the studio to streamline and retool the formula, to focus on big, all-star monster smash-ups and keep those going with only the most popular monster creations. Had Varan been a bigger hit, there might have been a Godzilla vs. Varan, or maybe Godzilla would have faded altogether and Mothra and Godzilla would have continued alone. But that didn't happen because Godzilla took hold as a character, one whose sheer popular appeal was unbeatable. 50 years on, Godzilla endures as an internationally recognized pop culture icon. So, yes, this is a ludicrously silly movie in whatever edition or cut you happen to watch. Enjoy it for that, and make a toast to the demented imagination of Shinichi Sekizawa. Because before 1964, Godzilla was a sporadic enterprise with an uncertain future. And after 1964, it is a veritable pop cultural juggernaut that keeps on going. Thank you for listening. This has been David Kalat and the 1965 American cut of Ghidrah the Three-Headed Monster. I hope you enjoyed it.